Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, it is finally time to talk about another deck that is near and dear to my heart, and that is none other than my top 4 deck from the 100th YCS in Long Beach, California from March of 2012. For those of you who have been watching my videos, you might have recognized my top 4 trophy. That is the one over my shoulder, the one with Blood Memphis. That event is memorable for more than just top 4ing. For those of you who weren't there at Long Beach in 2012, it is really the most memorable event for way more reasons than just the event itself. That event was, at the time, the largest trading card game tournament of all time. Magic the Gathering has since taken that achievement with some of the events that they've had in Las Vegas, but at least at the time in 2012, it was recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest trading card game tournament of all time. Konami anticipated a large crowd, but not quite 4,400 participants. As a result of the crowd, Konami needed to book a second room, collapse the barrier between them, and increase the size of the venue just to house that many players. Konami actually ran out of entry mats. The tour bus mat that they gave out at the beginning of the event, they ran out of tour bus play mats and needed to mail them to players in the aftermath of the event. The event went so long on day one that the final round of Swiss did not end until 1 o'clock in the morning. And not only did it end at 1 o'clock in the morning, Konami needed to cut off the recommended number of day one rounds in order to get to a 1 o'clock end. And as a result, we needed to come back as the players at 8 o'clock in the morning on day 2 in order to compensate for the round that was left off at the end of day 1, which means there was only 7 hours between the end of day 1 and the beginning of day 2. So we're talking about a grind and an endurance test beyond anything that I personally had ever experienced in terms of Yu-Gi-Oh! At least, where you're eating dinner at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning at whatever you can find, whether that was a McDonald's drive-thru or anything else, and then waking up just a couple hours later in order to play day 2. I mean, for those of you who have played YCSs, you know the drill about staying up late and only sleeping a couple hours, but it's not usually forced by the venue itself and by the tournament itself. Usually you elect to stay up late day 1, go out to dinner, enjoying your friends, and you elect to wake up early the next morning. This was totally different. Konami was like, event's gonna end 1 o'clock in the morning day 1. We literally can't go any further, or else we might have, and you have to be here at 8 o'clock the next day. It was something unlike anything I'd ever experienced. So being able to get all the way to the top 4 and playing that far into the event is really memorable to me, because obviously whenever you have success, it's memorable, but it's just one of those things that I think back to, and I think about the grind, because it was, yes, a Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament, but it was such an endurance test as well. And there are even more stories. It gets quite crazy beyond that, because I booked a flight from LAX at 9 o'clock at night Sunday, which generally speaking is good. That's a perfectly late at night time to fly out of a YCS if you weren't planning on staying until Monday. 9 o'clock's pretty late. You think you leave the venue or you leave your hotel around 7, 6:30. Usually the venue closes before then anyway, so that's plenty of time. Well, not YCS Long Beach, not at all. It was getting so late and so close to the flight that Paul Clark, my close friend who I flew out to the event with, by the top 32 and the top 16 when I'm still playing, was starting to freak out, and I was freaking out too, quite frankly, questioning, are we even going to make our flight? We had a shuttle that I had booked that was going to bring us from the venue to our airport. I got to a point where I told Paul, just find your way home. Fly home, take the shuttle, take the flight, don't worry about me, I'll work it out. But in addition to telling him that, I also told him, don't worry about your luggage, I'll figure that out. At this point, his luggage, our clothes, were at that point in time in another individual's hotel room, because we didn't book a Sunday night hotel, so we just left it in our close friend's hotel room. Which makes things really complicated, because when I was eventually knocked out in the top 4, it was still about 7:45, 8. There was still a universe where I might be able to get myself to LAX and not miss my flight. I elected to try and do so. I told Konami I couldn't play out the top 3, 4 playoff. That's why I actually have a 4th place trophy, not a 3rd place trophy, because we never played out the top 3 and 4. But as a result, good friend of mine, Steven Schaefer, individual from Lowell, Mass, someone who I played with at Larry's Cards and Comics, good friend of mine back in the day, was willing to drive me to the local hotel. I was able to get our luggage, Paul and I luggage, and then I was able to drive to the airport. Steven, again, was able to do that for me. Schaefer brought me to the hotel, and I literally walked on my flight at about 8:58, a couple minutes from takeoff. Finally sat down, finally decompressed, hadn't eaten all day, and I remember buying a bunch of the silly food that you can buy at the airport or on the flight. It was just an unbelievable event for so many reasons, from the actual event itself to the grind, the endurance, the decks, and everything in between. It was just a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and you really needed to be there to appreciate it. But Anyway, beyond the story time, let's talk about the event itself. Going into the event, you needed to prepare for heroes to a lesser extent. I'll put that sort of on a tier 1.5. But the big three were really Dino Rabbit, Insectors, and the Wind-Up Loop, the Wind-Up Hunter Loop. Past that, yes, Dark World was a deck. Obviously, I lost to in the top 4. They were hero beat, and then there were some anti-meta-ish decks I don't think were very good. Round 1, I played against TGs. I actually played against TGs twice that event. I played against the 6 Samurai deck pretty early in that event. I played against a few other decks here or there. Gravekeeper's not a deck I played against, but it was a deck that you could have played against. A Bubble Beat deck, which is a little bit different than the Hero Beat deck, a little bit more emphasizing Elemental Hero Bubble Man. But those are really the top decks. Yes, a Mystic Piper deck, top 4. Yes, a Beast Wind-Up deck, top 8'd. Yes, Chainburn, top 32. There were decks that were beyond the top decks that did top. When you have 4,400 players, that's going to happen. But those are really the decks that you anticipated playing against. And to me, what I wanted to do is take advantage of the trend in the format where people were emphasizing Maxi and Effect Veiler in the main deck to counteract Insectors and Wind-Ups by electing to run a deck that really wasn't affected a lot by those two cards. Maxi, at best, 1-for-1s, a Miracle Fusion or a Monster Reborn. And then Effect Veiler's borderline unplayable against E-Heroes. Yes, you have Stratos, but past that, there's nothing else. You're going to side them out. But if your opponent has those cards in their main deck, which a lot of people were doing, you could capitalize on that in Game 1. I then elected to not run any of those hand traps myself in Game 1, which was a pretty radical decision. A lot of people at bare minimum had Maxis in their hero deck, but I elected not to run any hand traps in order to smooth the consistency of my deck. I figured the only time I won hand traps is Game 1 going second against Wind-Ups. Really, those 3 things. I will concede the games where I lose the die roll against Wind-Ups and they draw the loop, might I add, in order to make it so that if I had won that die roll, I could have just set my traps. And if I set a Torrential Tribute, that's as good as a Maxi against the Wind-Up deck. If I just have all of these trap cards, I can stop Wind-Ups from doing their combo. It's a matter of if I won the die roll. And as a result, now I have this deck that's positioned well against all of the decks instead of having these hand traps that were only good against a narrow sliver of the format. And I just commented on it. I played against 2 TG decks in the Swiss. I played against multiple rogue-ish decks during Swiss. It was probably a good thing that my deck was a little bit more streamlined, more centered on spells and traps, as opposed to some of the hand traps. It made it so that, yeah, I did absolutely, I remember clear as day, lose to a Wind-Up deck. Game 1, something like round 7 or 8. I was still undefeated at the time. I remember my opponent went Magician, Shark, turn 1, and I just scooped. I didn't even show the cards in my hand by discarding them. I just scooped. I won Game 2, and he decreed me Game 3 and ended up winning. I conceded that matchup before the tournament, though. I knew that was likely going to happen. I had to mentally get into a position where I knew I would be Wind-Up looped Game 1, but at least give myself Game 2 and 3 by, in Game 2, opening and having the ability to set traps. And then at least I'll have the Maxi going in Game 3, and anything can happen at that point. So those decisions were made ahead of time. But what it did is it made it so that I didn't have these dead hand traps against a lot of the other decks. I played against multiple Dark World decks beyond the one that I lost to in the top 4. Played against the TG decks, like I mentioned. And I think, big picture, with a field of 4,400 players from all over the world, I wanted a deck that gave me the best chance of actually winning the event, as opposed to necessarily just topping the event. And again, I ended up losing in the top 4, so maybe there were some tweaks that could have been made, and I'll comment on those in the deck profile. But it's still a deck, whether it's the story of the actual event itself, or just the deck in and of itself talking about where it was positioned in that format, that will always be near and dear to my heart. But without further ado, this is a look at my top 4 deck from the 100th YCS in Long Beach, California. All right, before we get into the deck profile, I will point out I actually still have the 4th place trophy from YCS Long Beach, the 100th YCS. I don't think this is an actual Blood Mephiston, the trophy. A lot of people have asked me about that over the years. I think it's a sticker or just 2 halves of a card. If you had this in person, you would see what I mean. I don't really think this is an actual Blood Mephis, but this is the trophy. I'll put it off to the side. All right, we'll start the profile off, obviously, with 3 copies of Neos Alias, the 1900 Light Gemini Elemental Hero. Obviously did everything that you wanted in this deck, and you had the 1 single copy of Stratos to either search it out or to pop back rows using Stratos' spell and trap card destruction effect. Then we had 2 copies of Thunder King Ryo, 2 copies of Beast King Barbaros, and a Crusader of Endymion. We'll start with Crusader because I got a lot of questions back in the day about this choice. For me, Crusader was better than the 1900 Fire Gemini, because I know the 1900 Fire Gemini can be searched by reinforcements of the army, but you have 3 targets, really 4 if you have reinforcements of the army. I'd much rather have a light attribute, because I just think light attributes were way better than fire attributes. Novermaster is a cool card and all, but the Shining is really your win condition out of the extra deck, so I wanted as many ways of accessing that as possible, and I did want a 4th Gemini in the deck. So that's why I elected Crusader of Endymion over the Fire Gemini. Barbaros comboed, obviously, with Skill Drain. Those two have been comboing with one another for large portions of Yu-Gi-Oh! History, particularly at this phase of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s time. Barbaros also did technically give you another attribute, otherwise you really only had access to a Wind Light attribute out of the extra deck, so having access to Gaia could potentially come up. And then 2 copies of Thunder King Raya. A lot of people ask me about this too. Why not 3 copies of Thunder King Raya? Why not Bubble Man also? My goal going into this event was to build the most consistent deck possible, and one of the ways that this deck could lose is being flooded with monsters. You might also then argue, though, well, this deck could be flooded with spell and trap cards, and you can just simply not draw monsters by having such a low monster count. Well, to me, there's 9 clear monsters in the deck, but there's also 2 copies of Elemental Hero, or Emergency Call rather, 1 Reinforcements of the Army, and then honestly even Monster Reborn and Miracle Fusion are pseudo-monsters. Obviously they take combo pieces to get there, but they are pseudo-monsters. To me, this deck had much closer to 12 or 13 monsters, depending on how you want to evaluate it, in addition to having cards like Pot of Duality to dig to the monsters. So to me, the low monster count wasn't much of an issue. Plus, if you don't happen to draw monsters, assuming your hand's just not cluttered with Miracle Fusions, which is the worst case scenario, the cards that you could be drawing into, like Torrential and Dimensional Prison, can generally buy you a little bit of time. Now, I get it. If your hand's Hero Blast, Gemini Spark, Miracle Fusion, and no monsters, absolutely, you're probably going to lose. But to me, I felt like those combinations of hands weren't going to be overwhelmingly likely. And the moment you got access to one, particularly Elemental Hero, it would unlock your hand. But those hands are not unlocked by a Thunder King Raya. If your hand is Hero Blast, Miracle Fusion, Gemini Spark, drawing into Thunder King Raya because you played 3 doesn't really change anything. You still have to stall out with your spell and trap cards until you do get access to any hero. So I felt like the 2 Thunder King Rayas were a good choice because the other end of the spectrum is having a hand of double alias Thunder King, which just isn't that great. I'd much rather increase the density of my spell and trap cards and assume that I'll eventually, over the early stages of the game, get access to any hero, which will unlock so much of my deck. So just 2 Thunder King Rayas. I know that was really a big discussion back in the day when I first played this deck. In terms of the spell count, or the spells, we have 3 copies of Pot of Duality. This card, obviously a great card in spell and trap heavy decks. Great card in a deck that doesn't necessarily need a special summon at time. Now you do. You have Miracle Fusion, but it's not necessarily your #1 game plan, so 3 dualities is obviously great. We have 3 copies of Gemini Spark. Sequencing Gemini Spark is obviously really important. Taking advantage of players who do not respect Gemini Spark is obviously really important. You know, if somebody just plays bottomless on one of your E-heroes, specifically Alias, but also Crusader, being able to chain the Gemini Spark there is just absolutely backbreaking if your opponent left another card on the board. We have 3 copies of Miracle Fusion. We maxed out on the full 3. Yes, it can contribute to early dead draws, but when you do have access to this mid to late game, it can be absolutely backbreaking. The Shining is an incredible card. Then in order to actually draw into or get access to our Elemental Hero package, we have 1 Rhoda and 2 E Emergency Calls. Yeah, it makes our deck a little bit more vulnerable to opponents' Thunder Kings, plus the fact that we have Pot of Duality in the deck. But these are just way too important. We need to get access to E-Heroes as fast as possible. These are great ways of doing so. Then some more of the one-ups. We had 1 copy of Monster Reborn, 1 copy of Dark Hole, 1 copy of Book of Moon, and a card that took a lot of people by surprise that weekend. I actually remember it 10 years later, is Heavy Storm. Heavy Storm is one of those cards that you would think in a deck with as many traps or chainables as this, you wouldn't necessarily want mass spell and trap card destruction, but this deck absolutely did. You could make a lot of pushes backed up by Heavy Storm, utilizing Miracle and Monster Reborn on the second or third turn, for example, or on the same turn. As a result, Heavy Storm is just really, really useful. Players did not expect it. And if you could chain a bunch of your back rows, like for example, you said Hero Blast, Gemini Spark, and you go heavy chain both, you can take a lot of advantage because maybe that incentivized your opponent to respond by setting 2 or 3 back rows, and now you just got a +1 or 2. In terms of the trap lineup, double Torrential Tribute. I love Torrential Tribute. It's one of those cards that I think when you use it properly can be an absolute blowout card. 2 copies of Dark Bribe. The decision to run Dark Bribe was predicated on this deck's use of Skill Drain. It's not the #1 game plan, but it is absolutely a route to victory. You can simply back up Skill Drain with Judgment, Starlight Road, and Dark Bribe and win games against Insectors or Windup. So Double Dark Bribe allowed you to use that game plan. It also pushed through Miracle Fusions for game. That happened a lot. 2 copies of Dimensional Prison. I'll point it out now. I have no copies of Bottomless Trap Hole in this deck. One of the main reasons why I liked it to run Deep Prison is it's one of those cards that's better going second. So for example, if your opponent opens with Thunder King and you have Bottomless in hand going second, that's obviously really bad because Bottomless set against an onboard Thunder King doesn't do anything. Deep Prison, on the other hand, actually does counteract that Thunder King Ryo. Now granted, it's weaker against the Inzektor matchup, which is absolutely prevalent. It's weaker against some of the other possible matchups too. But I think that ability to hedge on that first and second dynamic was really useful. And your deck has a lot of ways of dealing with Inzektors, from triple Gemini Spark to Skill Drain to Torrential, Hero Blast, which we'll talk about in a moment. So with all of that in the deck, Book of Moon 2, you could run cards like Dimensional Prison. Then we have 2 copies of Hero Blast that allows you to destroy a monster and bounce back in Neos Alias. Really useful card. I elected only to run 2. You'll notice the spell, or rather the trap lineup, has a lot of 2-ofs. I think that was probably the better choice as opposed to maxing out on some of these. Hero Blast in 3 was really common, but again, my whole objective going into the weekend was to smooth out the draws as much as possible, and opening double Hero Blast with no heroes is one of the ways of losing. Your deck already has enough of that stuff with Miracle Fusion, Gemini Spark. 2 copies of Skill Drain. It was a potential win condition against some decks. It wasn't great against other decks like Dino Rabbit, but it was generally pretty good, and with Barbros, it did in fact give you a win condition that most opponents didn't necessarily anticipate. There were some matches where, you'd have Barbros on the board, your opponent would MST this, you would chain it, pay the 1,000, but now your Barbros is permanently at 3,000, and you could win games because of that. Double Warning, obviously basically a borderline staple at the time, and then some 1-ofs. 1 Judgment, 1 Starlight Road, and 1 Mirror Force. So obviously a lot of traps in what a lot of people consider a stun deck. I'll go into the extra deck first before talking about the side deck. We had 1 copy of Stardust Dragon, that's the only synchro, to combine with our Starlight Road. I ran 1 copy of Gaia, 1 copy of the Great Tornado. I ran 2 copies of Absolute Zero. This is going to combine with the Snowman Eater from the side deck I'll talk about in a little bit. Technically, I ran 2 copies of the Shining, but I have 2 copies here, but I did run 3. I did run 3, not 2. I ran 2 copies of Nova Master. I ran 3 copies because I cited Super Polymerization and I wanted to have fire targets when playing against Dino Rabbit. Those are the fusions. Next, we have the Exceed monsters. We have 1 copy of Acid Golem and 1 copy of Zen Mains. This was a mistake in retrospect. I'll point that out now. But this was here because I had Snowman Eater in the side deck, which was a little bit fringy in retrospect. The only way I'd go into this is with Reborn plus Snowman or double Snowman, which was unlikely. I think it's okay to have 1. I'm a big fan of those fringe extra deck monsters if your deck has room. This deck, though, could have actually benefited from maybe a second Gaia because you're main decking 2 Barbaroses, potentially another Blade Ninja. As a result, I think I would have cut one of these, probably Acid Golem. My logic there was that Acid Golem is really good with Skill Drain, but we're talking about really fringy. A situation when you have Skill Drain and double Snowman Eater. Just Zen Main is probably enough. But in terms of the 4s, we have Utopia, Utopia Ray, and Blade Armor Ninja. I could see you go double Utopia, maybe. Double Blade Armor Ninja and cut one of these. Totally reasonable. Another card that I think I could have played and I didn't is Dragon Knight. I think Dragon Knight's pretty decent because your deck has obviously a lot of warriors in it, and if you're playing against an opposing deck with Starlight Road, it's not impossible that your opponent goes into Stardust Dragon. You also theoretically can Super Polymerization your own Stardust Dragon, which is a little fringy, but there could be a situation where you have Stardust Dragon and a warrior, you attack with both of them and then Super Poly into this, because this requires a Dragon-type Synchro Monster and 1 warrior. I think that would be better than the really, really fringe rank 3s. Before we get into the side deck, let's talk about the top decks at the time. There is, of course, the deck that I lost to in the top 4 of Long Beach, and I was prepared for it. A lot of people considered this a bad matchup. I don't think it was actually that bad of a matchup. Lost to it, but I did beat it actually in the top 64. Lost to it, though, in the top 4. That's Dark Worlds. There's, of course, the big 3 at the time. There was Dino Rabbit. I actually wrote out a Dino Rabbit deck list the morning, or probably the night before Long Beach. I was that close. I actually used to have a picture of it on my phone. The Dino Rabbit deck I almost ran at Long Beach before I switched to Heroes. There was obviously the Wind-Up Hunter version of Wind-Ups. There was Inzektors, and then there was the Mirror Match. This is the actual Stratos and one of the 3 actual aliases from the deck that I used at Long Beach. I've since found foreigns or higher rarity versions, so I don't have them in the deck. But these are the ones I used at Long Beach, so they have a sentimental spot in my heart. It doesn't seem like a lot, but these are really the top decks. Chaos Dragons are not really out yet. Final Countdown was not popular yet, so this was really it. You might have a fringe Gravekeeper deck. You theoretically have that wind-up beatdown deck from the top 8, but really, quite frankly, going into the event, these are the ones that you could anticipate facing. As a result, I had 3 copies of Snowman Eater in the side deck. These were for the mirror match and for Dino Rabbit. We had 2 copies of Maxi. You might have noticed that one of the themes of this deck was not to incorporate any hand traps in the main deck. My goal was to minimize the dead draws, or minimize the cards that could contribute to dead draws, with the expectation of playing in such a wide array of decks with over 4,000 players. As a result, I put the hand traps in the side deck. These Maxis were particularly good, obviously, against windups. We had 2 copies of Super Polymerization. Super Polymerization was one of our outs to Lagia, specifically out of the Dino Rabbit matchup. We had 2 copies of MST, which is just generic, obviously good spell and trap removal, but it's good against even decks like Dark World when you hit their gate of the Dark World. Sometimes pretty good in the mirror match, baiting out or popping back rows, identifying and reading what the back rows are and hitting the ones that really frustrate them. It's also really good against other back row heavy decks. 2 copies of Smash and Ground, which this was at a point in time where a lot of people viewed this type of card to be good against decks like Heroes or a deck like Dino Rabbit, so I agreed with them and ended up playing Smash and Grounds. Forbidden Chalice was good against specifically Snowman. Snowman was one of this deck's downfalls. The 1900 defense on this and the fact that it can just 1-for-1 trade with a Alias or Stratos is really, really frustrating. This was one of the most difficult cards to deal with. So at least with Chalice, you could keep the Elemental Hero on the board. It also had some utility because decks that sided this were sometimes decks like Windups or even decks like Rabbit, and Chalice wasn't the worst against either of those. You could use this on a Zenmati or use this on a Lagia when they used the negation, so double Chalice was decent. And I said I was prepared for Dark World, which I really was. I actually had 2 copies of Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, which was both a concession for the Dark World matchup, but another concession for the Inzektor matchup. Essentially going into games 2 and 3, I had 4 copies of either Skill Drain or Shadow Imprisoning Mirror against Inzektor. So I thought that matchup was actually pretty much in my favor. But nevertheless, this is the top 4 deck list that I used at the 100th YCS in Long Beach, California. It is a deck that is near and dear to my heart. It's a deck that I was never able to replicate success with. I played this at 2 future YCSs. Obviously a little bit different than this build, but I ended up going X3 at both of them. I think I made it to day 2 in one and then lost on day 1 in the other, but still a deck that, regardless of my performance in the future YCSs where I ran it, absolutely is a really, really sentimental deck, a deck that I will always remember, and I really, really look forward to profiling. So hopefully you enjoyed the profile as much as I enjoyed putting these cards back together. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.